People also felt that if you took a Chinese baby and an English baby and tried to teach them Chinese, that the Chinese baby would, of course, learn Chinese much faster, because all his ancestors spoke Chinese, all through history. And they even tried this, and they found that it wasn't the case at all, that they both learned at the same rate. So one does not inherit acquired knowledge. You have to learn this. One is not born with bigotry and prejudice and patriotism or anger and self-centeredness. These are nurtured through the environment. If one is born with a larger brain, with more neurotransmitters, you can learn how to be stupid faster. On who you associate with. So there really is nothing in the brain that can distinguish significance or relevance. That's acquired by experience only. Parents have an understanding of this when they forbid their young children to play with other kids who they feel are a bad influence. When parents want their kids to become a physician, they put them in a medical environment. If they want them to learn how to build bridges, they put them in an engineering environment. People often say, well, I know two children. One is a thief, both from the same family, and one is a minister. So if it's environment that causes behavior, then how do you account for that? Well, people have to go to school for years to be able to work on a jet engine, but they let anyone raise kids. And children are far more complex than any jet engine. Very often parents pit one child against the other, and they say things like, why can't you behave like your sister? She picks up everything, she does all her homework on time. Well, when that sister falls down the stairs, the little boy is going to have a slight grin on his face. So it's never from the same environment, even though the children come from the same household. Our environmental influences have become so ingrained in our habits, our feelings, and our outlook that we often think it's human nature. Well, there really is no such thing as human nature. What there is human behavior, and that's always been changed. Otherwise, we'd still be living in caves. So people often think that jealousy is part of human nature. And someone once tried to back this up by saying, well, every time I pick up my cat, my dog growls. This is really easy to overcome. If you give your dog a treat, every time before you pick up your cat, then your dog wags its tail. Every time you go for your cat, your dog will wag its tail. So if this was really innate behavior, then your dog would never wag its tail under these circumstances. Dogs can be trained to rescue people, to be ferocious, or they can be trained to lead the blind across the street. They could come from the same breed, or even from the same litter, but the difference in behavior is due to their training. Excuse me a minute. Our culture does not evaluate human behavior in this way. If they did, they begin to ask very different questions. They begin to want to know how they would begin. They would come to very different conclusions about how society should be run and why people behave the way they do. They would begin to ask what it is in our culture that generates greed and racism and bigotry and serial killers and aberrant behavior. As I mentioned, all the blame is put on the individual today, instead of on the culture that they're raised under. If the conditions that generate these values remain unaltered, in spite of all the urgings of the priest, or all the laws of the politicians, or all the romantic words of the poet, the aberrant behavior will persist. Whatever better values we aspire to, or whatever better behavior people aspire to, cannot be realized when we have hunger, unemployment, deprivation, war, and poverty. People deprived of income will do whatever is necessary to provide for the necessities of life, if not for themselves, but then for their families. Their values may be exemplary, but their behavior will reflect the reality of the situation. After World War II, for example, you could find the most respectable German families fighting over scraps of food. Eventually, we will understand that most forms of so-called criminal behavior which fill our jails are generated by the scramble for money and property in an age of often contrived scarcity of the monetary system and the values that it generates.